Good morning. This is Haley Solomon with the North Carolina Housing Coalition. Thank you for joining us this morning for our housing call. And without further ado, I will turn it over to our Director of Housing Policy, Stephanie Watkins-Cruz.
Good morning, everyone. I hope you are having a great week so far. I'm going to go ahead and kick it off with organizational updates. Just a friendly reminder that early bird registration for our 2024 North Carolina Affordable Housing Conference is now open. The conference is going to take place on September 5th and 6th at the Raleigh Convention Center. You can get the best rate if you register before close of business on August 9th, and you'll be able to check out more information about registering, hotels, speakers, and sponsors in the call notes. We'll have that linked for you. Moving on to federal updates. There is a lot happening. We are currently waiting actually for the Senate Committee on Appropriations. We're waiting on their top line funding allocations. They've already voted recently to increase funding substantially for the Department of Defense. So that has a few housing advocates really concerned because it can mean deep cuts to non-defense spending such as housing. The U.S. House Committee on Appropriations Subcommittee on Transportation, Housing, and Urban Development, or CHUD, is expected to release its draft of its fiscal year 2025 spending bills for the Department of Housing and Urban Development, HUD, later this week, even as early as today. They are scheduled to review this proposal on the 27th, so on Thursday, and they are proposing to consider the bill on the floor on July 10th and actually vote the week of July 9th before they break for August. The main takeaway that I want to leave you all with is there's a lot of talk about possible cuts, and really what we need to communicate to our representatives is that funding for HUD's programs must increase every year to at least maintain the number of people and communities currently served. Obviously, that's not ideal. We want them to increase to continue to address the growing needs. However, it just seems like we are at this point where we need to protect the resources that we have and that we're getting at the federal level. And it's a huge concern that any cuts, right, to programs and reduction in assistance puts so many households, thousands and thousands of people at risk of housing insecurity, eviction, and in worst cases, homelessness. Also on the federal level, we're expecting the Supreme Court to announce their decision on the Johnson versus Grants Pass Supreme Court case. We've put a few different links underneath this part of the call notes to show what different national organizations are talking about when it comes to how to advocate to your lawmakers when it comes to unsheltered homelessness, and then also how to really think about focusing on solutions, whether or not the Supreme Court decision comes out favorably against criminalizing homelessness. I also want to lift up a few funding opportunities. The Department of Housing and Urban Development, or HUD, recently released an eviction protection grant program, notice of funding opportunity. And then there's also a request for proposals for the National Reentry Housing Incubator, or Housing Incubator. This is a new opportunity for community-based organizations and faith-based institutions that are seeking to implement or enhance and improve their reentry housing program to support a safe and successful transition to people reentering the community after incarceration. The organizations selected for this initiative are going to receive up to $140,000 in funding, in addition to training and technical assistance to develop various evidence-based, effective, and sustainable reentry housing solutions. So applications for this are due July 19th, and you can learn more about both of those funding opportunities, the Eviction Protection Grant Program and the National Reentry Housing Incubator through links in the call notes. I also want to announce that the National Low-Income Housing Coalition, National Housing Law Project, and the Tenant Union Federation this morning released a comprehensive National Tenants Bill of Rights. And the aim here is to shift the balance of power between tenants and landlords and redress really the long-standing racial and social inequities that happen within that relationship and advance housing justice. So this Bill of Rights sets out 7 essential rights that follow tenants' experience from applying for housing all the way to signing a lease, all the way through living in their home. So this is a great example of a policy tool that can be used to craft policies to protect tenants at all levels of government. You can learn more about that National Tenants Bill of Rights through a link in the call notes. And we are going to see if we can find an additional expert to join us on the housing call to talk further about really what the impact of this policy could be. There's also a feedback opportunity with the Federal Housing Finance Agency. They're requesting input on the application for the Federal Home Loan Bank Affordable Housing Program, and so the comments will be accepted until August 19th. Moving on to state updates. There's also a lot of budget talk and a lot of movement happening right now. The House released their version of their budget of the fiscal 24-25 budget last week, as well as the Senate. The changes to housing funding really can be boiled down to a few key points. So there was a decrease in the housing reserve appropriation created last year for a pass-through to the Workforce Housing Loan Program. And then for 2024 through 2025, from $45 million in non-recurring to $10 million in non-recurring. But that $45 million is made up by leftover ERA 2 money. That $35 million of it has been allocated to replace that housing reserve money that is being taken back. So a lot of swapping, basically, of funds. There's been a recommended $1.1 million increase in the Community Block Grant Aging Adults and Home Repair and Improvements Program. $35 million in non-recurring funds that were originally given to Dare County, returned from fiscal year 2022 through 2023, is being reverted to the Housing Trust Fund, and $23.6 million of the remaining ERA 2 money, so Emergency Rental Assistance Phase 2, is being recommended to go back to the State Housing Trust Fund and comply with those requirements set out by the U.S. Treasury for emergency rental assistance. There's also a few technical changes that are recommended in the House version. They increased the North Carolina Housing Finance Agency's bond and construction loan debt limit from $3 billion to $12 billion, which is key, so we're happy about that. It allows them to continue to do their work and avoid kind of unnecessary pauses or really halts in their really critical programs. And then it also clarifies that information obtained by the Housing Finance Agency for purposes of housing survivors, for survivors of domestic violence, sexual abuse, and human trafficking are not public records. And this comes from, if you recall, when they passed the budget last year, there was dedicated funds for housing survivors of domestic violence, sexual abuse, and human trafficking. And so this is a part of that program. The Senate version has a lot of some of the same things. The main difference that we found in relation to housing is that instead of reallocating the Emergency Rental Assistance Phase 2 or ERA 2 money for two purposes, the Senate version proposes that the full $58.6 million in leftover non-recurring funds be allocated to the Housing Trust Fund to be used for, and this is a quote from their proposal, eligible programs administered by the Housing Finance Agency. And projects under this section will comply with the United States Department of Treasury's emergency rental assistance guidelines, and these funds are hereby appropriated for that purpose. The Senate passed their own budget proposal yesterday. They were working late into the evening, so we're continuing to watch. There is still a lot of gaps between the budgets. The main source of disagreement is really how and whether or not the surplus is spent and placed in reserve, as well as a few items such as raises for teachers and child care subsidies. An additional bill that we're keeping an eye on that we want to list up have been following a lot of great work from our friends at the North Carolina Budget and Tax Center. Senate Bill 630 is set to appear on the floor today if it moves past the Senate Rules Committee. And this bill proposes a constitutional amendment that would lower the cap on income tax rates to 5%. So we just want to list up a few concerns that could impact housing when it comes to this bill. Property taxes are rising consistently across our state because local governments are having to find this consistent way, but also creative ways to fill the gaps left by low-income tax rates at the state level. So if this were to be capped, we're going to continue to see more of this. This would in fact likely ensure it. I also want to lift up that some counties actually rely on state revenue more than others. Some rely on more than 1/10 of their annual budget coming from the state. And so thinking about how this cap would impact their revenue and their ability to serve their communities. This could also impact the borrowing costs for states in building more affordable units because revenue limits are connected with credit downgrades. There's been a bit of back and forth on this. So the state would have to borrow money in order to kind of face this potential consequence. But it's still concerning, right? It could limit a potential source of revenue for investing in affordable housing. And then I also just want to lift up that the tax load is likely to increase for middle and low-income taxpayers, which we know is already pretty disproportionate when compared to those who are more wealthy. Moving on to local community updates, there are several different efforts across our state, particularly those shifting from emergency shelter to homeless prevention, and then also buying older properties for permanent supportive housing. The first is Salvation Army. Their emergency shelter program in Gastonia is deciding to transition to homelessness prevention. So the Army of Gaston and Lincoln counties is planning to transition its longtime 64-bed emergency homeless shelter to a homelessness prevention program at the end of August. So this switch is coming after a result of a 2023 community study, which decided that prevention programs will focus more on rapid rehousing and case management, and that would be more cost-effective and impactful. The other services that are offered through the shelters, such as the food pantry and emergency financial assistance programs, will continue to operate after the shelter's closing. So an interesting shift in service provision there. The city of Greensboro recently moved forward with purchasing the former Summit Executive Center apartment complex using Community Development Block Grant, or CDBG funds. Once a development partner is identified, the city says it plans to redevelop the property into about 25 units of affordable housing. One example that that kind of relates to the last bill that we mentioned, but Wilmington City Council decided to trim its tax rate hike ahead of a budget passage, and it also decided to reject an anti-camping ordinance. So they voted 2-5 against an anti-camping ordinance that sought to criminalize sleeping on city property. Last year, however, the New Hanover County Commissioners did enact an ordinance that prohibited sleeping on county property, which mainly targeted people sleeping on county-owned properties in downtown Wilmington. Moving on to events, there are several great events happening this week and into July as well as August, so I'll just list up a few. I want to lift up that today at 2 p.m. there is a webinar, All Hands on Deck, talking about mobilizing a broader network of advocates being hosted by the National Low-Income Housing Coalition, the Alliance, and the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities. So this webinar is going to focus on how do you build a diverse range of advocates who are able to discuss innovative strategies, build bigger coalitions, and engage persuadable lawmakers and push back against the harmful counter-narratives about homelessness. So I'm sure that's going to be a really powerful webinar. The link to register is in the call notes. There is also a webinar happening on Friday from 11 a.m. to 12:30, hosted by the Urban Institute, talking about loss mitigation strategies and the different lessons and opportunities that we can gather from the COVID-19 pandemic. This is an in-person event. There will be an affordable lending fair on Saturday, June 29th, from 11 to 2 p.m. in Wilmington, North Carolina. The city's Housing and Neighborhood Services Department is going to host its annual affordable lending fair at the MLK Center from 11 to 2 p.m. The main focus of this event is to provide resources, information, and support to residents that are seeking affordable lending options. So this event is free and there's no registration required. If you are in that area, make sure to check it out. We have the full address in the call notes. Moving to reports and resources, Last week, we were looking at the state of the nation's housing in 2024, released by the Joint Center of Housing Studies of Harvard University. So it talks about mostly the biggest takeaway is how housing costs are straining owners and renters alike, and there are millions actually being priced out of homeownership. There are also several pieces in the news, but I know it just hit 10 a.m. One that I want to list up in particular is that from NPR, we know we're in an election year, so I just want to lift up a piece by them that highlights what the leading presidential candidates have to say about soaring housing costs. And from WNC, that highlights how millions are struggling with home prices and that housing is becoming a top issue for voters. That's all for today. There are several other links that you can check out in the call notes. Remember, if you ever want us to talk about something in particular or you want us to dive into something a little deeper, don't hesitate to reach out. I hope you have a great rest of your week, and we'll talk to you next time.